The email came on a Friday morning while I was deep in a design deadline, my third coffee going cold beside my keyboard. I almost didn't see it. My inbox was a disaster that week. Client revisions stacking up like unpaid bills. And I'd been filtering everything non-urgent into a folder I promised myself I'd check later. But the subject line caught me before I could scroll past it. Regarding a handmade walnut clock possible ownership inquiry. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I pushed back from my desk and walked to the hallway closet where I kept the box of things I couldn't bring myself to display, but couldn't bring myself to throw away. My father's tools, his old flannel shirt that still smelled faintly of sawdust if I pressed my face into it and tried hard enough, and the space on the shelf where his clock used to sit, empty. I'd noticed it missing 3 weeks earlier and told myself I'd moved it, that I'd simply forgotten where I put it, that the blank space meant nothing. Because what the alternative actually meant about the people I was still living with was something I hadn't been ready to face. I went back to my desk and opened the email. Miss Rachel Dunn, my name is Arthur Clemens. I own Clemens Antique Restoration on Birchwood Avenue. A walnut mantel clock was brought into my shop this week for appraisal and possible resale. Upon examining it, I found hand-engraved initials on the base T.D. and a level of craftsmanship that is genuinely unusual. I did some research and believe this piece may have been made by Thomas Dunn, a local woodworker. If this clock belonged to your family, I'd ask that you contact me before I proceed with any transaction. I haven't completed the paperwork yet. Please call at your earliest convenience. My father's name was Thomas Dunn. He had carved that clock himself when I was 11 years old. A whole summer in the garage, me sitting on the workbench, handing him chisels and asking questions he always answered with complete patience. He'd let me engrave his initials into the base with a small tool, guiding my hand. It had sat on our mantel for my entire childhood, then came with me when I moved out, then came back to me after he died 2 years ago when I moved temporarily back into the house that no longer felt like home. I called Arthur Clemens from my car in the parking garage. He answered on the second ring. His voice was steady and careful, the voice of a man who had learned to deliver difficult news gently. He asked me to describe the clock. I described it exactly. The walnut grain, the brass face, the small repair on the left side where I'd accidentally knocked it off a shelf when I was 14 and my father had fixed it without a word of reproach. Arthur Clemens was quiet for a moment. That's the one, he said. I think you should come in. I told my client I had a family emergency, which was true enough, and drove across town. The shop was on a quiet block between a bookstore and a florist. The kind of street that felt like it existed slightly outside of regular time. Arthur Clemens was older than his email voice had suggested, maybe 70, with wire-rimmed glasses and paint-stained fingers and the deliberate movements of someone who had spent decades handling fragile things. He shook my hand and led me to a workbench in the back. My father's clock sat under a warm lamp, looking smaller than I remembered, the way things from childhood always do. I reached out and touched the walnut surface before I could stop myself. You knew immediately, Arthur said. It wasn't a question. It's been in my family since I was a kid. My father made it. Arthur nodded slowly. I thought so. The joinery technique is exceptional, the kind of thing you don't see from hobbyists. Your father was a serious craftsman. He was a carpenter by trade, I said. But the woodworking was what he loved. The piece was brought in by a young woman, said it was hers to sell. I don't always ask too many questions when provenance seems straightforward. He paused. But something about this one bothered me. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. So I did what I always do with pieces that trouble me. I examined it more carefully than I normally would. He picked up the clock and turned it toward me. The base unscrews, he said. That's not standard construction. Your father built something into this clock that most people would never find. He twisted the bottom quarter turn. It came free with a soft resistance, like something that had been sealed carefully and opened rarely. Inside the hollow base, wrapped in a small square of waxed cotton cloth, was a folded envelope. I looked at Arthur. He looked back at me with the expression of a man who had already decided whose side he was on. I haven't opened it, he said simply. It didn't belong to me to open. My hands were not steady when I unwrapped the cloth. The envelope was addressed in my father's handwriting, blocky and deliberate the way it always was, each letter formed with the same care he brought to everything he made. It said only, for Rachel. When the time comes. I had to sit down. Arthur pulled a stool from beneath the workbench without being asked. The letter inside was 2 pages, front and back, written in the same careful hand. Rachel, if you're reading this, the clock found its way to someone honest. I built this compartment the year after your mother and I separated when I started to understand what kind of man Dennis Farrow was. Not a bad man, exactly, just a man who sees everything as a resource. His daughter is the same way. I don't say this to be cruel. I say it because you are trusting in a way that has always made me proud of you and worried for you at the same time. In the safe deposit box at Merchants Trust, Box 318, there is an account I opened in your name when you were born. I added to it every year with what I could manage. There is also the deed to the workshop property on Caldwell Road, 2 acres. Clear title, no mortgage. I paid it off last year. It is yours. I never told your mother because I knew she would tell Dennis, and Dennis would find a reason it should benefit Brianna. The key to the box is inside the clock face, behind the brass plate. You'll need a small flathead to remove the screws. I am sorry, I am not there to hand this to you myself. I am sorry for a lot of things I was too quiet about for too long. You never needed me to fight your battles, but I should have stood beside you more visibly while you fought them. You are the best thing I ever made, and I don't mean that the way fathers say it. I mean it the way, I mean good joinery, built right, built to last, built to hold weight. Take the clock back wherever it ends up. Don't let anyone tell you it isn't yours. It was always yours. All my love, Dad. P.S. The workshop has a storage unit in the back. Your old pottery wheel is in there. I kept it. I thought you might want it back someday when you had space again. I sat on that stool in Arthur Clemens' workbench and cried in a way I hadn't cried since the funeral. Arthur disappeared quietly and came back with a paper cup of water and set it beside me without saying anything, which was exactly right. When I could breathe normally again, I looked up. The person who brought it in, I said. Was it a young woman, late 20s, dark hair, talked a lot? That description fits, he said carefully. My stepsister Brianna was 27, had dark hair she changed the color of every few months, and had never in her life experienced a silence she didn't feel compelled to fill. She had moved into the house after her father Dennis married my mother 4 years ago, and had spent those 4 years treating every object in every room as a collective resource she had equal claim to, including, apparently, things that had belonged to my dead father. She mentioned a boutique, Arthur said. Something about needing startup capital. Of course she did. Brianna had been talking about her boutique for 2 years. A curated lifestyle brand, she called it. She'd had a business plan printed and bound that she showed anyone who sat still long enough. She needed investors. She needed capital. She needed, as far as I could tell, for the world to simply hand her what she wanted, because she wanted it with sufficient enthusiasm. How much did she ask for it? She wanted $4,000. I offered $2,500 as an opening, told her I'd need to do more research before I could finalize anything. He looked at me steadily. That's why the paperwork isn't done. I had a feeling. I looked at the clock on the workbench. I looked at the letter in my hands. Can I buy it back from you? Whatever she was going to get, I'll pay it. Arthur shook his head. Take it. I never completed the transaction. Technically, this clock is still unclaimed property in my shop. He paused. Your father sounds like he was a good man. He was the best person I knew, I said. He just wasn't loud about it. I drove home with the clock on my passenger seat and the letter in my bag, working through the brass plate with a small screwdriver I found in my glove compartment at a red light. The key was exactly where my father said it would be, tucked into a small recess behind the plate, held in place by a piece of electrical tape. Small, brass, numbered 318. My mother and Dennis were in the kitchen. Brianna was on the couch with her laptop, probably working on her boutique's Instagram presence, which she had started before she had an actual boutique. They all looked up when I came in. I set the clock on the dining table facing them. The silence was immediate and specific. The kind of silence that knows it's been caught. My mother recovered first, which was always how it went. Where did you find that? At Clemens Antiques on Birchwood, I said, where Brianna brought it to be sold. Brianna started from the couch. Don't. I didn't raise my voice. My father had taught me, without ever explicitly teaching me, that the most effective thing you could say was often the quietest. Don't start with an explanation that's actually an excuse. Just tell me when you took it. It was just sitting in the closet, she said. And there it was, the tone she always used, the one that said, obviously, and you're being unreasonable. And why do you always make everything so dramatic, all without using any of those words? You weren't even displaying it. I thought. You thought what? That because I wasn't displaying it, it wasn't mine. Dennis set down his coffee mug. He used the voice he brought out for negotiations. The measured, reasonable voice that I had learned was actually more dangerous than anger because it dressed up unfairness in the language of logic. Rachel, this family shares resources. You've been living here for 2 years. I pay rent, on time, every month. And Brianna has a genuine business opportunity. She has a fantasy she's been describing for 2 years without taking a single concrete step toward making it real. I looked at Brianna, who had closed her laptop, and was watching me with an expression I recognized. The look she used before she started crying, which was her primary tool for redirecting any conversation that wasn't going her way. And even if it were a real business, that would have nothing to do with my father's clock. He made that, with his hands. The year I was 11. You had no right to touch it. Your father has been gone for 2 years, my mother said, and her voice had taken on the thin edge it got when she was about to say something she'd wrapped in concern to make it sound like care. At some point, holding on to every single thing he left becomes what? Becomes inconvenient for Brianna, becomes about grief, she said, and not about moving forward. I looked at my mother for a long moment. I had spent a lot of time over the past 4 years trying to understand the distance between the woman who raised me and the woman standing in this kitchen. I had landed, eventually, on the understanding that it wasn't a distance she'd traveled after marrying Dennis. It was a distance that had always been there, and my father had quietly stood in front of it for the whole of my childhood without ever letting me see it clearly. I am going to say this once, I said. I want the money, whatever Brianna was going to get for the clock, $4,000, by the end of the month. If I don't have it, I will file a police report for stolen property. That clock was in my possession. It left my possession without my knowledge or consent. That's theft. It doesn't matter that you have a key to this house. You wouldn't do that, Brianna said. I'm your sister. You are my stepfather's daughter. I picked up the clock. And I am done pretending that means the same thing. I went upstairs. My mother came up 20 minutes later and knocked on my door and said things I had heard before, in various configurations, that I was being cruel, that I was making things harder than they needed to be, that my father would have wanted us all to get along, that Brianna was sensitive, and I knew that. I listened to all of it through the door, and then I said, clearly and without any particular emotion, Mom, if I don't have $4,000 by the end of the month, I'm filing the report. That's it. That's the whole conversation. She left. I heard her telling Dennis I was impossible, which I had been hearing since I was 17. That evening, I drove downtown to Merchants Trust. I hadn't been inside in years, but the building was exactly as I remembered it. My father had done the carpentry work on the interior renovation when I was in middle school, and he'd pointed out his work every time we walked past. See the crown molding on that teller window? That's mine. I had always felt a small, quiet pride about it. The way you feel pride about things your parents made that outlast ordinary notice. The safe deposit manager was a man named Gerald, who had clearly been working in that exact room for most of his adult life and had achieved the particular stillness of someone who has seen people open boxes containing everything from life-changing documents to complete disappointments. He brought box 318 to a private room without comment. I sat alone and opened it. There was a folder with bank documents, an account in my name, opened when I was an infant, 34 years of steady, modest deposits that had grown to a number I sat with for a long time before I was able to feel it properly. $112,000. My father had never made large amounts of money. He had simply been consistent in a way that I understood, looking at those records, must have required real sacrifice. There was a deed. 2 acres on Caldwell Road, clear title, my name already on it. I didn't know the property. I would look it up later and find a small workshop building. Solid construction, on a parcel of land at the edge of town that had been quietly sitting there with my name on it while I'd been paying rent to live in a house that no longer felt like mine. There was a second letter, shorter. I know you, Rachel. By the time you read this, you will already have decided what to do. You are better at that than you give yourself credit for. You always were. Just know that whatever you choose, I already approved of it. The workshop needs work, but the bones are good. I always thought it would make a good studio if you ever wanted to go back to making things with your hands. No pressure. It's yours to do whatever you want with. Also, the account, use it for yourself, not for anyone else. I know how you are, Dad. I cried again in that small private room. Gerald, when I came out, handed me a box of tissues from behind his desk with the practiced discretion of a man who had done this many times before. I thanked him. He nodded once, professionally, and that was that. I drove back to the house that night with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I thought about calling a friend, then thought about calling a lawyer first, then called the lawyer, a woman named Patricia Osei, who a colleague had recommended months ago for a contract dispute that I'd ultimately resolved without her. Patricia picked up on the fourth ring. I summarized the situation: stolen property, deed, account, potential civil recovery of the $4,000. She listened without interrupting. "Come in Monday," she said. "Bring the police report if you file one. Bring the deed and account documents either way. And take photos of that clock tonight base. Initials, everything." I photographed the clock from every angle. I photographed the hollow base, the waxed cloth wrapping, both letters, the key. I sent everything to my email and to a cloud folder and to Patricia. Then I started packing. I didn't have much that was really mine in that house. The accumulated debris of temporary living books, clothes, my work equipment, a few things from my father's estate. It all fit, when I was honest about it, into a manageable number of boxes. I had been living there as a guest in my own life for 2 years, and I hadn't quite let myself see it until that night, pulling my things out of drawers and closets and realizing how lightly I'd been holding everything. I booked a hotel for the week. I'd figure out the rest once I knew more about the Caldwell Road property. Saturday morning, I drove out to see it. The workshop was a single-story building, maybe 900 square feet, set back from the road behind a stand of oak trees. My father had built it, I would later piece together, over several years in his spare time, which meant every joint and surface reflected the same meticulous care as everything else he'd ever made. The roof was sound. The floors were hardwood, dusty but solid. There was a wood stove in the corner and windows along the north wall that filled the space with the kind of even, indirect light that is almost impossible to find and almost impossible to overvalue. In the back storage unit, under a canvas tarp, was my pottery wheel. My father had bought it for me when I was 16 and passionate about ceramics in the absolute, consuming way that teenagers are passionate about things. I had taken it to college, then to my first apartment, and it had somehow gotten lost in a move 6 years ago. I'd grieved it quietly, the way you grieve small things incompletely, with guilt for caring about an object. He had it. He had kept it all this time. I sat on the dusty floor of that storage unit and held my hands against the wheel's surface and felt something in my chest release that I hadn't known was clenched. I went back to the hotel and called Patricia. She had already done preliminary research. The deed was clean. The account transfer was straightforward. She'd reviewed the photos I'd sent and had a question about the timing of the clock's disappearance and whether I had any documentation of it having been in my possession. "I have a photo from 6 months ago," I said. "I used it as a background element in a work presentation. It's time-stamped." "Perfect," she said, with the particular satisfaction of a lawyer handed exactly what she needs. "That establishes possession. Their taking it without your consent is clearly theft under state law regardless of any shared household arrangement. File the report." I filed it that afternoon. The officer who took my statement was a woman my age who listened carefully, examined the photos on my phone, and typed everything with the unhurried competence of someone who took property crimes seriously. She gave me a report number and told me what would happen next. What happened next, it turned out, was that Brianna called me crying within 4 hours of the report being filed. This was, I suspected, because the reporting officer had made a courtesy call to confirm details, and somehow the word charges had entered the conversation. I let the call go to voicemail. She called 3 more times. Then my mother called. I listened to my mother's voicemail, which moved through several emotional registers in under 90 seconds: concern, hurt, accusation, and finally a cold statement that I was tearing the family apart over a clock, which was a sentence that told me everything I needed to know about how she was choosing to understand the situation. I texted back, "Patricia Osei is my attorney. Please have Dennis contact her directly. Her number is in the email I'm sending now." I moved into the workshop 2 weeks later. It took some work, a proper bathroom installation, a small kitchen setup, insulation in the walls for winter. Patricia handled the account transfer and the deed recording. The $4,000 from Brianna arrived through Dennis, paid without comment, 11 days before Patricia's deadline. I suspected Dennis understood the math better than Brianna did, which was that $4,000 was considerably less expensive than a theft charge on his daughter's record. The account my father's 34 years of quiet saving I left almost entirely untouched for the first 6 months. I needed to know it was there before I knew how to use it. I needed to feel the difference between having it and needing it, which my father, I think, had understood when he set it up. I contacted the contractors my father had listed in a small notebook tucked into the deed folder. Outstanding invoices, several of them, from jobs completed before his diagnosis. One company, a mid-sized developer named Hartwell and Associates, owed $14,000 for a custom millwork installation. My father had finished 11 months before he died. Their current website showed a thriving business. They had apparently hoped that the obligation had expired along with the man who'd earned it. Patricia sent them a letter. They paid within 30 days. Their lawyer called hers and called it a courtesy settlement. Patricia told me this with the same shark smile I imagined she reserved for moments exactly like this. I set up the pottery wheel in the north corner of the workshop, where the light was best. I hadn't touched clay seriously in 6 years. My hands remembered more than I expected them to, which was one of those things about physical skills that I'd always found almost unbearably. Moving the body keeps things the mind releases. My mother tried to reach me through relatives for about a month, the narrative being that I had abandoned my family over material possessions, that my grief had made me unreasonable, that my father would be heartbroken to see what I'd become. I responded to each intermediary the same way. I sent them a screenshot of the police report with Brianna's name visible and a one-line note. If she'd like to discuss this, she can contact my attorney. The calls stopped. Brianna's boutique did not open. This was not a surprise. The business plan, on examination by anyone who looked at it honestly, had always been a collection of aesthetic preferences and vague intentions with no underlying structure. Without the clock, money, and, I suspected, without the expectation of ongoing access to a household that would subsidize her. In the meantime, the plan dissolved quietly into the ongoing project of her Instagram presence, which continued to curate a life that didn't quite exist yet. Dennis called once. He said he wanted to discuss the situation, and he said the word with the particular neutrality of a man who doesn't want to admit what the situation actually is. I told him I had nothing to discuss that wasn't better handled through Patricia and wished him a good evening, and hung up. It was possibly the most centered I had felt in 4 years. Arthur Clemens came to see the workshop in the fall, at my invitation. I had told him what was in the clock when I came back to thank him properly, and he had listened with the careful attention of a man who understood that some things are worth hearing in full. He walked through the space slowly, touching the window frames, examining the floor joinery with the appreciative eye of someone who spent his life looking at how things were made. "Your father built this," he said. It wasn't a question. "Over about 8 years," I said. "I didn't know about it until he left it to me." Arthur stood at the north windows for a long moment, looking out at the oak trees. "He built it for you, though," he said. "You can see it in the choices. The windows face north for the light. The ceilings are high enough for large work." He was thinking about a person who makes things. I had thought about this too. My father had watched me work for years ceramics as a teenager, the graphic design that became my career, the occasional woodworking projects I took on in whatever space I had available. He had been paying attention in the particular way of people who love quietly and plan carefully, who build for the future instead of announcing it. The clock sits on a shelf I built myself along the east wall, on a bracket cut from a piece of walnut salvaged from a damaged piece I bought at Arthur's shop. I didn't plan that detail. I noticed it after I'd finished and then sat with it for a while, the way you sit with things that mean more than you expected. I open the base sometimes, not to check the letter, I have it memorized now, both of them, but just to feel the mechanism, the quarter turn, the soft resistance of something built to open when the right person knows how. My father designed that. He thought about every person who might ever hold that clock and built it so that only someone who knew it intimately would find the secret. And then he spent 20 years waiting to see if the right moment would come. He was a quiet man. He fixed things without making a production of fixing them. He built things he didn't describe. He loved in a way that showed up years later in smooth joinery and clear titles and 34 years of steady deposits. And you had to be paying attention to see it. And I had been. And I am. The workshop smells like sawdust and linseed oil and wood smoke from the stove. And in the mornings, when the north light comes in flat and even across the floor, it is the most completely mine place I have ever been. I am learning to make furniture now, which feels like a conversation I am finally ready to have. My hands are learning a new vocabulary of cuts and joints and grain directions, and every time something fits together the way it should, I think of my father in his garage on a summer afternoon. My 11-year-old self sitting on the workbench asking questions. He always answered every one. People who knew him sometimes tell me that he talked about me constantly to his contractors, his suppliers, old friends he saw at the hardware store on Saturdays. They say he described my work, my projects, whatever I was doing at the time, with a specificity that meant he was actually listening when I talked. I didn't know this when he was alive. I know it now, and it lands differently than it would have then. The way all the best things he did land differently now that I understand how deliberately he did them. He knew, I think, that the clock would matter. He knew that if someone tried to take it, it would be because they saw only its surface value. He built it so that the surface could be taken, but the substance couldn't. That's exactly the kind of thing my father would do. Construct a situation where greed defeats itself, where the people who took the thing for money were the very people whose taking it led to the thing it was hiding. He was a carpenter who thought like an engineer and loved like a poet, and the world didn't make a lot of noise about him while he was in it, and he wouldn't have wanted it to. I make noise for him now. In the way I work, in the way I hold what he left me, in the way I stopped being quiet about things that deserved to be spoken. He always said close enough wasn't good enough when you were building something to last. I think he meant more than joinery when he said it. I think he meant everything. The clock keeps good time. I have never had it serviced. I think it doesn't need it. My father built things to last without requiring constant maintenance, and this one, like all the others, is doing exactly what it was made to do. It sits on its shelf in the north light and marks the hours of my life in this space, and every tick is his handwriting, and every day I am here is time he gave me, and I am not wasting a single second of it.